Well, I think in a word, Alex, I'd say it's dramatic. Worst case, if the product data isn't of the standard, doesn't have the right information in it, they just simply won't be able to be sold. Empowering consumers with information about products before they buy, then we all have to be speaking the same language. Otherwise, the value of that information just disappears.
Hello, welcome to today's podcast, presented by Pimberly, the enterprise SaaS product information management and digital asset management platform. My name's Alex. Today on the podcast, we're going to be hearing about the future of product data in IT distribution, an industry where product data is incredibly complex. And to help me talk about that, I'd like to welcome my guest today, Tim Bodill. Welcome, Tim.
Hi, Alex. Thanks very much for the intro.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us. And would you like to give a quick introduction to yourself, your career experience, your position here at Pimberly, and what kind of things you've been focused on in the last year around IT distribution?
Sure. No problem at all. So I'm an IT service provider career individual. So all of my career has been providing custom-built solutions for customers around networking, data storage, just the traditional elements of IT, really. In the more recent times, I've been focusing more specifically on product data and the quality of product data in particular, with new legislation like the ESPR, which stands for the Eco Design for Sustainable Product Regulation. I remembered it first time. That with things like that coming in, it's causing people finally to start looking at their data, their product data, in a way that perhaps hasn't been done previously. I think, certainly in my experience, what a lot of organizations have done quite rightly is looked at where the data is stored, how secure the data is, some very important things, but not so much around what's actually in the product data. And I think ESPR, as I'm sure we'll talk about over the next few minutes, has caused people to look differently at where the data is coming from, how they're managing the data, what they're doing with it, and what's expected from them really more and more with the quality of product data.
And you talked a little bit about the complexity of data and what's actually in there. Maybe we should jump off into the first sort of topic here, complexity to clarity. We mentioned again how, IT distributors have these huge product catalogs. And what are some of the common pitfalls that you would see when you're talking to these kind of businesses when they're managing that scale of data?
I think one of the challenges that IT distribution has had forever really is the fact that they've got various sources of data from their various vendors. Their key supply chain is generally vendors, many of those well-known names. And of course, they are of a scale and a size that means they don't necessarily want to be told what to do, and they have their own ways of doing things. And so they'll provide their data to their customer chain in the format that they wish to do. I think, historically, disties have put an awful lot of manual effort into managing that supply chain data to make sure that it's of the right level. But again, I think going back to what I was saying earlier, the new legislation from the EU in particular brings about new reasons for people to look at the quality of the product data and to manage that in perhaps different ways that they've done before, to have different requirements from their vendors than they may have had before. Just if I can just talk about that complexity piece, if you're dealing particularly in the world of IT distribution, where you've got some very complex products from a vendor with an enormous portfolio of products, historically, it's been really important to make sure that you get the right part to go with the right device, for example. That there have always been reasons why product data quality has been important. But I think what we're seeing coming on the horizon is a new set of requirements that will require a different type of focus on that product data, because there will be legal ramifications if there are any problems with the product data. Or potentially, worst case, if the product data isn't of the standard, doesn't have the right information in it, then products won't be made available for sale in certain territories. It will be as simple as that. They just simply won't be able to be sold. So I think, yes, we're all aware of the complexity and all of the challenges that has historically brought with it in terms of managing a very, very large inventory of products. But I think what we're looking at now is what's going to be required in the future and how that will drive a different type of behavior from some organizations with regards to how they manage their product data.
Yeah, and there's quite a few kind of outputs, benefits, advantages to having that data more clearly organized, structured, and defined. For example, time to market, being able to go to market with the right data more quickly, for example. What kind of measurable difference in time to market or customer experience can having this data in place make for an IT distributor?
Well, I think in a word, Alex, I'd say it's dramatic. We've got examples in customers where we've already seen improvements in time to market in the region of 40 to 50%. One of our customers, Evo Group, reported a 40% improvement in time to market for their products. But actually, the scale of that improvement is really not limited in any way to that sort of 40 or 50%. The scale is really limited to the creativity and the ability to automate process. I think there's a couple of points I want to really bring out here. One, a lot of this has been available for some time with products information management systems like Pimberly that have been available for some time in helping people to take data from various sources, to enrich that data, to manipulate that data, to produce that data in a format that's acceptable to their various output channels. There is already a kind of a well-trodden path for a lot of people in terms of the process of doing that. What I think is really changing, and I think where people are starting to see a different value in product data, or the fact that there is a value in product data, is that it actually translates very easily into time and therefore resource costs. So, if you can demonstrate that through product enrichment automation, product data analysis automation, whatever that might be, that you are reducing human intervention, that you're cutting down the amount of time required by people to do things, then clearly there's a value to that. I'm going to speak a little bit kind of expectation and conjecture now as to what might happen in the future. But as things like ESPR become embedded in culture and they become expected from consumers and they're expected from supply chain and they become legislated, so they become mandatory in a legal perspective as well, that value on the product data becomes much more tangible because you can very quickly see that a vendor providing you with a better quality set of data about their products means less work for you, and less work for you is easy to put a price on. I think, and because the legislation isn't fully defined yet, because we've had the legislation announced, it was introduced last year, but we don't yet have the definitions of how that's going to roll out, how it's going to be rolled out for specific products and specific sectors. There's a lot of conjecture in how that's going to pan out. But I think it's plain to see that having good quality product data will answer a lot of questions for you, of which compliance is one of them. It's great also that it will fix the perennial problem I talked about earlier of what parts go with what other parts. That's kind of an added benefit of it. One IT vendor, a PC manufacturer, very well-known four-letter PC manufacturer, was talking to me about this recently, and they, one of the things that the challenges that they have is matching the right support product to the physical product. And obviously, service is a very, very important part of business for a lot of these organizations, a very growing part of their portfolio. So having something which helps to automate that process not only means that you're cutting out resource and time costs, but it also means that you're going to have less problems. You're going to have less failures because it'll be right more of the time, theoretically.
Exactly. And, you've already touched on a little bit there, but it's not just about, firefighting or that kind of thing. It's really about a strategic advantage in the sector, isn't it? Against competitors. And it's not just about, ticking the compliance box or, avoiding the fines and things like that, which is obviously very important. but there really are wider advantages to this, aren't there?
Yeah, I mean, it's something I really wanted to make sure that we covered on this call, that was to talk about the differentiation opportunities that come with changes like this or evolution like this. It actually does present some challenges for people. In your traditional supply chain, the vendor will be required to provide the data, but the supply chain will be equally required to maintain and to pass that on in a way that will ultimately reach the consumer in a compliant form. So, being the one that does that most efficiently, most effectively, bearing in mind the previous conversation that we had about the value assigned to product data or the growing value of product data, being the one that does that best is clearly going to give you competitive advantage. So it's presenting a market opportunity without wanting to sound too much like a salesman in a way that hasn't been available before. It's something else that people can say, look, we are good at this. We can do better than other people. And I think that applies all the way across the supply chain. In IT distribution, it's very clear to see. And of course, lots of other sectors will have a similar opportunity as this legislation gets rolled out.
Yeah, especially in the distribution kind of industry where you are in the middle of that supply chain. You've got your manufacturers that are providing the information to you. You're providing information out to the retailers. On both sides of that, if you can collect and enrich that data in a good way and then provide it in the format that the retailers need on the other side, definitely a big advantage when you're dealing with partners and customers on both sides there.
I think so. Yeah, and I think the position of a distributor as a wholesaler, using that sort of supply chain structure, means that they're always looking. That the margins, as we know, are notoriously thin in distribution, so they're always looking for ways of adding value and differentiating themselves. And I think this is a great example of that. The reseller at the end of that supply chain will be required to provide DPPs to their customers, and the more it costs them to do that, obviously, the more painful it's going to be. So the more distribution can help in easing that or minimizing that new burden, the better.
Yeah, you just mentioned DPP there. So let's jump into that a little bit. The digital product passport, this legislation is coming in as being, across lots of different industries, not just IT distribution. Lots of different industries are going to be affected by this. But at sort of a high level, so the concept of a digital product passport, it's so that consumers can know where exactly all the constituent parts of the products they're buying actually come from, and that, it's about sustainability and all these things, all these great things. But it does present a challenge to all these different businesses that supply or manufacture or source all these products. So at a high level, what does it really mean for IT distributors specifically?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. Let's just step back a moment, if I may. The EU's primary objective, in my opinion, although there are several listed, but the primary objective of this legislation is to enable better consumer choice. It's to empower consumers with better information so that they can understand what they're buying and therefore make more educated choices about whether to buy more sustainable products. If I can give you an analogy, a comparison, the food nutrition labeling as we know it today was introduced formally in the UK about 17 years ago. And buying food today in the UK without that food nutrition label is almost unimaginable. Not only do you want to know all of that detail, but I think we're now all very familiar with the form that it takes, where to find specific bits of information, what it all means. I'm old enough, as you can see, to remember the days when you just didn't get any of that kind of information. And I think the EU's objective really is to get us to a similar place of consumer education and empowerment around anything that they buy, not just food products. As you rightly say, there is a plan that has been published, a timetable that's been published by the EU now in terms of how this gets rolled out. The third item on the list, as we see it, is electronics and information technology. And that's really when it's going to, obviously, it mainly impacts IT distribution organizations. We're expecting that, according to the latest timetable published by the EU, we're expecting that around 2027, the middle of 2027. And what that will mean is, at that point, if you want to provide any item that falls within the criteria as defined by the ESPR legislation to a consumer within the EU, which includes Northern Ireland, by the way, because of the Northern Ireland Protocol, then you will have to provide a digital product passport to go with it. Now, the actual content of the digital product passport, again, is something that's not fully defined yet. It's very much in the process and very close to being fully defined, but not quite fully defined. But our expectation is that for ICT, for information technology products, that's going to require quite a lot of work. ICT products have a lot of components. They have a lot of different components. They're sourced in different places. And all of that information we're expecting to be required as a part of a digital product passport for that equipment. If you take something like an iPhone, something ubiquitous like an iPhone, any of us that have worked in the industry will have heard all the stories about cobalt being sourced irresponsibly, for example. Yeah, I'm not suggesting for a moment, please don't publish the fact that I'm suggesting that Apple might not be responsible. I'm sure they are. What a digital product passport will do, and finally, is to publish to the consumer that detail. Where did the cobalt come from? How did it travel? How is it mined? All of that information. And so actually, again, going back to the point that you very rightly made previously, this is another area where it's an opportunity for people to differentiate themselves, because it will allow vendors to say, look, we are doing this completely ethically. And I'm sure Apple, picking on them again, will relish the opportunity to say to their end consumer, let's put all of the noise and the rhetoric to bed. These are the facts about where the materials were sourced, how they traveled, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of industries where that's already sort of seen as an advantage. I mean, food, you see that a lot already, in things like fair trade and things like that. I know that sectors, maybe these are the ones that are higher up in the list of priority for the DPP, like textiles, batteries, you mentioned cobalt, things like that, will face this sooner than later, or already dealing with this. So what kind of lessons can IT distributors learn from those industries that are already sort of in the thick of this?
Forgive me for sounding a little bit like a broken record, but I think, textiles, as you've already mentioned there, is the very first on the list, the first sector to be under the compliance requirements. And so what we've seen already there is that people have started to, I'm trying to pick the words rightly, I don't want to say wake up to, but people have started to recognize the fact that actually product data is going to be something that has value to them in the future. And the broken record piece is, it's all going to be about product data. It's all about, if you've got the right quality of product data, then actually compliance with some new legislation like DPP is not an issue. It's not something that you have to do anything else for. It will just be something that you are provided for because you've taken good care of that product data. And when I say that, it sounds a little bit glib, but it does draw people's attention to the fact that if you maintain your product data correctly, if you maintain your supply chain correctly, and you educate your supply chain on the quality of things that you expect, if you have the right systems in place so that you can store the data, you can automate the process of enriching the data, all of those things will mean that whatever the next compliance requirement is that comes along, you're going to be ready for it.
Yeah, I mean, we had a recent guest blog from a master data analyst at Exertis, and he was saying, they had a requirement to list all the laptops that were Copilot enabled, I think was the example. And because they'd had good master data management in place, using Pimberly, before the meeting was even over, they knew that they already had that information, so you can really get ahead of this just by following sort of best practices already. So we've done quite a bit of research in the past year or so, and we're going to do some more soon with the University of Essex, University of Manchester around DPP, and doing some market research and things like that. What's that sort of revealed, and how will that affect how you think businesses IT distributors will approach this?
So it's a really good point, and you're right. The projects that we've run with Manchester and Essex have really helped. The project with Essex was really to make sure that we understand the legislation properly. With Manchester, it was more about engaging with users and understanding how users might respond to new legislation being invoked or being introduced. And I think the one thing that took me a little bit by surprise, certainly in textiles, is one of the first questions was, what language are we going to use? Because different manufacturers use different languages or different specifications to describe their products. It's something that hadn't really occurred to me, but I think that's going to be a challenge for any sector as they approach this, that we need to make sure, like, again, using the example of food nutrition labeling, if we're going to be empowering consumers with information about products before they buy, then we all have to be speaking the same language. Otherwise, the value of that information just disappears. So in the world of textiles, for example, I'm very pleased to say that I'll fit in a medium from some stores, but in other stores, I have to go for a large. Yeah, it's a very clumsy example, but it kind of shows that you can't just assume that the language that we're used to and the existing specifications that we're used to for describing things are necessarily going to be enough to help us to comply with things that come along like DPP.
So you've already sort of talked about a few predictions and done a bit of future gazing as we've been going along. But let's focus on that a little bit. If we're looking at the next sort of 3 to 5 years as this rolls out, what are the kind of trends or disruptions or even opportunities do you think are going to crop up for IT distribution?
Well, look, I am in danger now of really repeating myself. The enlightened organizations that we speak to have been working on the quality of their product data for some time. So I think, me saying to them that you have to have good quality product data is not going to be anything new. That's kind of, yes, that's something that we already have a focus on. But I think what will inevitably come over the course of the next 3 to 5 years is that people start to put different demands on that data once it's available. And that I can't even predict. Who knows what that might look like. But we all know that if you present somebody with something new that hasn't necessarily been available to them previously, then they'll find something else that they want from that. And my expectation with this technology is that it will drive an awful lot of that behavior. If there is suddenly a legal requirement to have information about the sourcing of precious metals, for example, as we talked about for battery production, what else? What other insights is that going to provide that will help the consumer ultimately to make better choices? But of course, that better decision making goes all the way up the chain. And one of the things that I fully expect is that as the distribution channel starts to look more at the data that it's getting from its vendors, that they and the feedback that they get from their sales, of course, that they will also start to make different decisions about the products that they're adding to their portfolio.
Absolutely. I mean, you can see it, can't you? When people realize, how far all the different places are from me that I'm getting all these things from, it might actually have an effect on consumer buying behaviors and things like that. And then, distributors could respond to that by choosing different products to source. And it's only through having that product data and doing analysis on that they'll be able to uncover those things.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very easy to be cynical about things generally.
Yeah.
But I think it would be hard to argue against the fact that food nutrition labeling has improved the way that people look at the food that they buy and the choices that they make, and a better understanding of what different types of food do to you. So, my hope, my expectation, and no one will really know until 5 to 10 years time how this pans out. But my expectation is that similar things will happen with DPP and with ESPR generally. That one of the examples in textiles that I was looking at is exactly as you described. That we have a very well-known premium brand in the UK that does a lot of its manufacturing, most of its manufacturing in the Far East. We have another very premium brand in the UK that makes a point of sourcing and manufacturing in the UK. Now, at the moment, apart from a little label that might somewhere say made in whatever country it's made in, there's very little that you've got to go on when you're buying garments. That's going to change. That's going to change dramatically. So, my expectation, my hope will be that the similar sort of behavior comes to electronics and electronic devices. The cynicism comes back to, in the example of textiles, your shopper in a certain premium department store is probably likely to pay much more attention to their DPPD sales than your shopper in a budget clothing store. So, I think it all has to be in context. It has to be taken in context.
Yeah, I think it'll be interesting to see, definitely. But it's only through having this that we'll be able to make that kind of judgment, I think. We've covered quite a lot, and I don't want to, again, turn you into the broken record, but it's good to go over these points. But just to close off, if you're advising an IT distributor today, as you do, what are sort of the top 3 areas that you would point them towards to stay competitive?
Obviously, number one has got to be just making sure you have the systems and processes in place to maintain the highest level of product data quality that you possibly can, and that you have investments and recognition of the fact that product data has a value to the business. Ultimately, I think people will start to see that. It will become a lot easier to measure. It will become a part of the transaction value. If your supplier has good product data, it will cost you less to integrate that into your systems than it will if they don't. And that will become much more visible. So there's number one. Understanding the supply chain and educating those involved in your organization with your supply chain around the requirements, the implications, the cultural behavioral changes that are expected from this, I think is inevitable. It's important. And more scrutiny, as I kind of alluded to a few minutes ago, around the suppliers, the vendors that you are using, the products that you're stocking. Ultimately, in the world of ICT distribution, if you are stocking products that prove very difficult to source the product data for, then they're not going to stay long on your books because you won't be able to sell any, and therefore, why would you be stocking? So I think summary: product data quality, supply chain, and making sure that people are educated around supply chain, and scrutiny of suppliers for product selection. I think there's a lot of crystal ball gazing, but that's where my head is at the minute.
Thanks, Tim, for sharing those insights. I'm sure there's plenty of talking points for IT distributors to think about from what you've highlighted there. That's all we have time for today, but be sure to subscribe to the Pimberly Perspectives podcast so you can keep up with future episodes. Also, be sure to give us your own perspectives by leaving a comment on this episode. Until next time, thank you and goodbye.